Welcome to lecture number 78. This is historical topic 7.10, the New Deal. The theme is politics and power. The one learning objective says, explain how the Great Depression and the New Deal impacted American political, social, and economic life over time. The first key concept introduces the 3 R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal attempted to end the Great Depression by using government power to provide relief to the poor, stimulate recovery, and reform the American economy. The 3 R's of the New Deal all serve a specific purpose, and there are different agencies that were created that are associated with each of these goals. The policies of the New Deal were developed with the help of the Brain Trust. This was a group of academics, economists, and people who Franklin Roosevelt trusted to come up with policies and programs that would help the country escape the Depression. Eleanor Roosevelt was Franklin Roosevelt's wife, and she became the face of Roosevelt's programs. Roosevelt was paralyzed from polio about 10 to 15 years before he became president, so Eleanor was able to travel across the country, meet with the people who were fleeing the Dust Bowl or unemployed. She brought that input back to the White House to try and advocate for those whom she met. The bulk of these programs are enacted in the first 100 days of his presidency. This established the precedent of judging future presidents by their ability to implement policies in their first 100 days in office. The New Deal is usually broken up into the first New Deal and the second, separated by several years. For our purposes, the New Deal can be thought of as one. You won't have to really know the distinction between the first New Deal and the second New Deal, but as the key concept suggests, you do have to know the difference in the programs between relief, reform, and recovery. Relief programs tried to create jobs and stimulate the economy. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration gave money to states and cities that were operating soup houses, gave out blankets and other basic necessities. Agencies like the Public Works Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the Tennessee Valley Authority were all attempts at creating government jobs that people could apply to with very little skill. They were available to all across the country. The Tennessee Valley Authority is still around today, and it worked to create dams around the Tennessee River Valley and generate electricity for that region. The Civilian Conservation Corps would send young men all across the country to build infrastructure projects like trails and parks. Finally, the Works Progress Administration, which will come a little bit later after the first 100 days, worked on other infrastructure projects like roads, airports, some parks, and schools. It was a lot of government spending with the intention of getting money in people's pockets. Then they would start spending money again, and that would make the economy bounce back. The next goal of the New Deal is recovery. This was meant to get the economy to grow once again. One of the first goals of the recovery was for people to regain trust in the financial system. Franklin Roosevelt would broadcast messages on the progress of the New Deal through what became called the fireside chats. He would get all of the broadcasting agencies to come to the White House, or he would go to a recording studio, and he would talk to the nation about what the federal government was doing to relieve the negative effects of the downturn. As people saw the government was more proactive, they would be more willing to spend their money and then put money in their banks. The Emergency Banking Relief Act created a bank holiday in the first 100 days of FDR's presidency. It closed all of the banks, and the banks would not reopen until the federal government said that it was safe for them to reopen. They would examine the balance sheets of the banks and make sure that they had enough money to be back in operation. This way, people knew that the government had given each reopened bank its seal of approval and that it was safe to leave their money in there without the fear that all of their deposits would be taken out by other people. The government also created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured people's deposits up to $5,000. So if a bank failed, the FDIC would pay the customers up to $5,000. The FDIC is still around today. During the Great Recession in 2009, the insured amount limit was increased once again to $250,000 to keep up with the rate of inflation. Other programs like the Farm Credit Administration and the Federal Housing Administration were trying to get people to spend money. The Farm Credit Administration gave farmers low-interest loans so they could keep their farms or to buy equipment necessary to maintain their farms. The Federal Housing Administration insured mortgages for people's homes. Unfortunately, the FHA adopted some discriminatory policies that led to a growing wealth gap between blacks and whites. Finally, the National Recovery Administration attempted to set labor standards across industries. They tried to set a minimum wage, a set amount of working hours, a set of standards in all the industries that were involved in interstate commerce, and eventually the NRA is declared unconstitutional for all of their policies. The Supreme Court deemed it to be too much of an intervention by the government in the economy. Reform policies and programs tried to implement safeguards to prevent another depression, or in the event of another depression, the effects of that depression would be less bad. The Glass-Steagall Act limits banks from risky investments like lending money to stock investors buying on margin. Glass-Steagall made sure that regular banks or commercial banks were barred from certain investments. The Securities and Exchange Commission investigated fraud within the stock market and required publicly traded companies to submit earnings statements to investors. The SEC also gets involved in cases of watering stock and insider trading. They ensure that everyone who's investing in the stock market has an equal chance of making money. The National Labor Relations Act, also referred to as the Wagner Act, makes labor unions legal in the United States. It allows unions to operate, and it keeps states from making laws that would make unions illegal. The Social Security Act created a national pension system for people over the age of 65. Finally, the Indian Reorganization Act is part of what was called the Indian New Deal. It attempted to reverse the negative impacts of previous U.S. policies against Native Americans that the federal government had taken since the 1800s. It tries to undo the effects of the Dawes Act and restores tribal sovereignty by allowing tribes to operate within their own tribal governments as semi-sovereign nations within the United States. This is a step forward for Native Americans in the New Deal. Natives, up until this point, had experienced a lot of land and cultural loss as a result of government policies that favored assimilation. This act doesn't fully make up for those losses, but it was a step in the right direction. Finally, the Fair Labor Relations Act sets a minimum wage, max working hours, and it ends child labor. These New Deal policies attempted to create a stronger foundation for the American economy, so that way another depression like this was less likely to happen. The New Deal had its fair share of critics, and they were coming from the ideological left and ideological right. This next key concept covers both. Radical union and populist movements pushed Roosevelt toward more extensive efforts to change the American economic system, while conservatives in Congress and the Supreme Court sought to limit the New Deal scope. The critics on the left called for more action. One such critic was a Catholic priest from Chicago, Father Coughlin. He used a radio program to call for nationalizing banks and inflating the currency. He became very popular, especially in the Midwest, but eventually the Catholic Church forced him to end his radio program. In his broadcast, he made comments that were anti-Semitic, and he was putting forth a fascist message. Eventually, the Catholic Church didn't want that kind of publicity. Huey Long was a former governor and a senator from Louisiana. He was asking for $5,000 payments to all Americans. His plans would supposedly pay for itself by taxing the wealthy. This was part of his Share Our Wealth campaign. He registered for the Democratic primary in the 1936 presidential race to challenge FDR, but in 1935, before the primary even really began, he was assassinated by one of his political rivals in the state of Louisiana. He didn't get that chance, but he had a huge following because of his populist message. Some of the policies that FDR eventually ends up adopting, like the Emergency Banking Act and Social Security, are very mild versions of what these two were promoting. The popularity that both of these critics garnered showed that there was a slight window for a fascist leader with a populist message to take control. Sinclair Lewis wrote a book in 1935 called It Can't Happen Here. The book's protagonist is a newspaper reporter who's witnessing the rise of a populist and fascist leaders based on Coughlin and Long. He was warning Americans of the same phenomenon that would happen in Europe. Countries like Spain, Italy, and Germany all let fascist leaders take control of their country, and just because the United States had a history of a democratic republic, it did not mean that they were immune from the same thing happening to them. Critics of the New Deal on the right were Republicans and conservative Democrats, including former presidential candidate Al Smith. They created the American Liberty League to oppose the New Deal. The Supreme Court was dominated by conservatives because the previous 3 presidents were Republican, and they collectively appointed 8 justices to the bench. The court declared a couple of the New Deal programs like the NRA and the AAA unconstitutional. Since FDR wanted to keep the court from stymieing the New Deal with questions of constitutionality, he suggested that the court be reformed in its makeup. Not only did FDR find the justices too conservative, he believed that their older age was also negatively impacting their decisions. He wanted to add another member of the Supreme Court for every justice over 70, with a maximum of 15. He tried to get Congress to adopt legislation that would allow him to nominate more Supreme Court justices, but it has not received well. Republicans were outraged, believing that FDR was making a power play, and even Democrats, his own party, opposed the plan for the risk it posed to the co-equal branches. Eventually, a lot of the Supreme Court justices end up retiring while he's president, and he ends up putting people in place that are more amenable to his policies. It becomes a non-issue in the end, but it is an example of when FDR tried to take more power for the executive branch. The next key concept talks about the lasting impacts of the New Deal. Although the New Deal did not end the Depression, it left a legacy of reforms in regulatory agencies and fostered a long-term political realignment in which many ethnic groups, African Americans, and working-class communities identified with the Democratic Party. Like the key concept says, there were limits to the New Deal. It did not fully end the Great Depression, and in fact, the country experienced a small recession within the Great Depression, shown on the employment chart on the slide. As New Deal programs were put in place, unemployment started to go down, but there was a spike of unemployment in 1937 and 1938. Economists usually point to a slowing in government spending during these years and the effect of the Social Security Act being put in place as likely sources. There's also a legacy of discrimination in parts of the New Deal. The Civilian Conservation Corps at first had segregated housing. The Federal Housing Authority mentioned earlier insured mortgages to make it easier to be approved for a mortgage and did not make it mandatory for bankers and lenders to not discriminate to be eligible for the program. The methods of determining which mortgages to insure were also discriminatory towards Black Americans and minorities. The FHA used color-coded maps of cities to indicate the risk level of insuring a certain mortgage. Red was too risky to insure, and it usually coincided with the only areas in which Black Americans and minorities were allowed to buy houses. Minorities were limited in their purchasing options because of restrictive covenants, or language in the deed of the home that forbade it to be sold to a non-white person. The effect of this is that African Americans and other minorities are not able to build wealth by buying homes as white Americans are for the rest of the 20th century. Since the FHA did not insure their mortgages, they weren't able to buy homes and build equity. Finally, New Deal programs disproportionately hired men. It operated under old gender norms in which men were breadwinners, so a man and a woman from the same household should not be hired in the same agency or by two different programs, because women would be taking away the place or the job for another man who was a breadwinner. This eventually ends up changing and more women are hired by New Deal programs, but this is certainly the case early on in the New Deal. The last two impacts are legacy of regulatory agencies and political realignment. The FDIC is still around, and they still insure bank deposits. The current limit is $250,000. The SEC still investigates fraud and investments and regulates the stock market. The political realignment happened as a result of the creation of the New Deal coalition. This woos African Americans to vote for the Democratic Party for the first time. This is truly revolutionary because it was the Republican Party that was the party of Lincoln, that who was responsible for emancipating enslaved people. So for them to vote for the Democratic Party shows that there was a huge shift in how African Americans viewed politics. FDR appealed to African Americans by being proactive and implementing New Deal programs that benefited them. A. Philip Randolph was a black labor leader for railway porters. He threatened to organize a large march on Washington to get FDR to do something about African American unemployment, which was always higher than the average throughout the Depression. FDR was responsive and pushed for more relief programs to reach African Americans. FDR also had the most diverse cabinet to this point in history. He had the first female cabinet secretary, Frances Perkins, as the head of the Department of Labor. He also hired more women for the mid-level cabinet positions, and in addition to this, working-class unions and urban voters continued to vote for the Democratic Party. The coalition still includes Southern Democrats that had a long history with the party, but they will fall away in the 1960s when Democratic President Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The last key concept is about the migration patterns during the Depression. The increased demand for war production and labor during World War II and the economic difficulties of the 1930s led many Americans to migrate to urban centers in search of economic opportunities. Future slides will cover the migrations during World War II, but for now there are two significant migration patterns during the Depression. Okies were farmers from Oklahoma who could no longer stay on their farm either from the Dust Bowl or mounting debt, or a combination of both. They take Route 66, a highway that takes them in the direction of California. Some of these Okies take jobs in the California Central Valley where there are more agricultural jobs. Some of this migration is documented by the Federal Art Project, which was also another New Deal program. The federal government was paying artists, photographers, and writers to go out and document what life was like during the New Deal. Some of the most famous photographs that we have from the Great Depression are those taken by Dorothea Lange. These migrations were the inspiration of John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, in which he follows an Okie family from Oklahoma all the way to the central coast of California. The family takes on agricultural work and endures dire economic conditions. The second migration pattern in this period was the repatriation of Mexican Americans during the Great Depression. It started under the Hoover presidency and went into the New Deal. These were mostly driven by cities, counties, and states. It was fueled by nativism, and it was an attempt to decrease the unemployment rate by decreasing the number of workers. So Mexican Americans, even those who were born in the United States and were American citizens, were pushed out. They were coerced at times and be given train tickets to get on a train and go back to Mexico. About half of the 2 million that were sent back to Mexico were U.S. citizens. They were either sons or daughters of Mexicans who had been born in the United States, or they were spouses of Mexican migrants that were American citizens, or they were Mexican migrants that were naturalized American citizens. And finally, here's the recap. The New Deal focused on relief, recovery, and reform as its main goals. There were critics of the New Deal from both sides of the political spectrum. The New Deal helped relieve the worst parts of the Great Depression, but it won't be until World War II that the United States finally leaves the Great Depression. Reform continues to affect society today, and discrimination continued to exist through the Depression and New Deal programs. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.